Welcome to I Don't Know What to Name This Show. I am your host, Sean Arguello. What is your favorite animated film of all time? Is it Beauty and the Beast for its timeless story? Is it The Lion King for its epic musical sequences? Is it Shrek for its all-star voice cast? Or is it Into the Spider-Verse for its beautiful animation? What if I was to tell you that there's a film that combines all four of those into one, featuring a timeless story, epic musical sequences, an all-star voice cast, and beautiful animation? This film is called The Prince of Egypt. Now you might be thinking, oh yeah, The Prince of Egypt, I've heard of that before. Maybe you've seen it, or maybe you've never even heard of it. Regardless, I'm here to talk about this cinematic experience and why this is my favorite animated movie of all time. Now, before I begin, I want to talk about this. I am not a religious person, but this film has always stood out to me with just a... how do I explain it? Gorgeous imagery, emotional with its story, the performances, and the music, which every time I listen to this musical score, it practically pulls at my heartstrings. And it gets me, I'll be the first to admit it, it gets me emotional. Especially during one scene, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. This was the second animated feature-length film from DreamWorks. The first one was Ants, and this was number 2. This came out December 18th, 1998, which is exactly 1 month before I was born. I was born January 18th, 1999. I've always found that pretty interesting. This film actually went on to win Best Original Song at the Academy Awards for the song When You Believe. But more on that song a little bit later. The music was provided with songs by Steven Schwartz, and it was composed by Hans Zimmer. And in my opinion, this is his best soundtrack that he's ever done for any film. But I need to talk about this film to try to get people to realize, even though this movie didn't change cinema the way that other animated films do, such as Lion King, How to Train Your Dragon for its amazing 3D sequences, heck, even Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs for being the first fully feature-length traditionally animated film. But I want to talk about The Prince of Egypt and why this film is something I hold near and dear to my heart. Even after all these years, from the first time I saw it to nowadays, I still go back and remind myself of everything that this cinematic experience is. Now, with all that being said, let me talk to you about The Prince of Egypt. From the very first frame of the film, you see animation. I mean, sure, it might be fairly basic animation. It's just clouds slowly getting dissolved into a sunset, and then bam! The song Deliver Us kicks in. The first of many epic songs from this truly outstanding soundtrack. This song is, in my opinion, the best opening song to any animated film ever. It's better than The Circle of Life, The Bells of Notre Dame, any animated film ever. This is the one. If I was putting together a top 10 list, this would easily be number 1. This would take the cake plus some extra frosting. It explains everything that's happening. It has emotional an emotional weight to it by having the Hebrews talk about how they're basically enslaved and they want to break free, basically. They want to be let go, to go back to the lives that they used to know before they were enslaved in Egypt. It then cuts to many Egyptian guards breaking into homes, stealing all of the newborn Hebrew boys, and slaughtering them. One thing I forgot to mention. This is an animated kids film. This is the reason why PG used to be much more important than it now is nowadays. Seeing mass infant genocide in an animated musical aimed towards kids, that's bold, DreamWorks, but I applaud you for that. My voice just cracked, but you know what? It is what it is. I'm 23 years old and my voice still cracks. Okay. So, let me continue. A mother and her 2 children, Miriam and Aaron, place their newborn son in a basket on the water and send him off into the river, where he's eventually picked up by the Pharaoh's wife and the Pharaoh's son, Ramesses. As the years go by, Moses is now voiced by Val Kilmer, and Ramesses, who is now voiced by Ralph Fiennes. Remember how I said that this has an all-star cast? I'm going to go through the people whose voices are in this film. Of course, as I already mentioned, Val Kilmer and Ralph Fiennes, but you also have Michelle Pfeiffer, Sandra Bullock, Jeff Goldblum, Danny Glover, Sir Patrick Stewart, Dame Helen Mirren, Steve Martin, and Martin Short. I seriously don't know how you have all of these talented actors in this movie, and somehow this film is still underrated. That makes no sense to me. Especially if this features one of the single greatest voice casts you'll ever see for any animated feature. It doesn't make sense why this motion picture doesn't get more recognition. But let me continue. So, Moses and Ramesses accidentally destroy part of a Hebrew temple by breaking the nose off of one of the statues, and pretty much causing a bunch of destruction and setting back the Hebrews who work on the structures. Basically sets them back a long time, because not only did Moses and Ramesses break the nose completely off the structure, but they also destroyed and caused a lot of sand to basically cause like a sort of like a dam breaking. And the sand basically just covers a bunch of... It just covers the whole place in sand, pretty much. That's really what I'm trying to say. I'm going to try not to over-explain. So anyway, the very next scene features Pharaoh Seti, voiced by Sir Patrick Stewart, and Seti's wife, Queen Tuya, I believe is how you pronounce it, who is voiced by Dame Helen Mirren. So Seti scolds both Ramesses and Moses for basically being irresponsible and their carelessness of breaking this temple, or breaking the statue, which ultimately is, well, according to Wikipedia, a temple. So meanwhile, while they're getting scolded, the high priests Hotep and Hoy, who are voiced by Steve Martin and Martin Short, and this is honestly my only complaint of this entire film. Steve Martin and Martin Short are 2 of the best comedians alive. And they're supposed to be the comic reliefs for this movie. It's just that they never really get a laugh. I mean, if you look at some of the other comic reliefs in films that were released at the time, Of course, you have Genie from Aladdin, Timon and Pumbaa from The Lion King. You have... drawing a blank on some of the other ones, but those are really the ones that step into my... really stand out in my mind. I guess you can also say, like, some of the characters from Toy Story, even though they had a lot of comic reliefs in there, but they still had an emotional weight. The Prince of Egypt honestly could have benefited from having a little bit more comedy. But overall, I think what they wanted to do was... the filmmakers wanted to get the idea that they're tackling a serious issue about slavery in Egypt. But still, even though it's, like I said, a serious issue, it would have been nice to have some comic relief to sort of break the tension every now and then. So anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so Moses basically suggests to the Pharaoh that Ramesses needs to be given the opportunity to prove his responsibility, and that night at a banquet, the Pharaoh actually names Ramesses as Prince Regent and gives him authority over Egypt's temples. And as Ramesses' first... excuse me. Sorry. The first thing he does as Prince Regent is actually crown Moses as royal chief architect. And in doing so, he actually gives Moses a ring, which is a scarab beetle, which is a very nice ring. And honestly, I kind of wish that was something that people would be able to buy, because it would be nice to have one of those rings. Just as like a little memento. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So anyway, Hotep and Hoi, the high priest is what I'll call them, they offer Ramesses a Midianite who they captured named Zipporah, voiced by Michelle Pfeiffer. And basically, Ramesses turns down the offer and tries to have Zipporah offered to Moses. But Moses ultimately ends up humiliating Zipporah because she tries breaking free. Moses grabs hold of the rope that her hands are bound to. She tells him to let go. He literally lets go, and she falls into a little pond inside of the temple where the banquet is being held. So, ultimately, Zipporah escapes after Ramesses tells one of the helpers from around the temple to clean her up and have her sent to Prince Moses' chambers. So anyway, during that, Zipporah escapes, and while Moses is chasing after her, he ends up running into his brother and sister, his actual brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, voiced by Sandra Bullock and Jeff Goldblum. Again, you can see how the talented voice cast is starting to kick in, having just all of these talented actors. And basically this brand new, fairly new studio, it was, like I said, this is only their second ever animated film. With only a $70 million budget, it ultimately grossed $218 million. But just having this amount of talent in this film, it's truly amazing. So anyway, Miriam tries sparking Moses' memory by saying that Moses is actually their brother, and everything that he was raised to believe has been a lie. Which ultimately it forces Miriam to sing... Oh yeah, I forgot to mention. During the song Deliver Us, there's a lullaby that Moses, Miriam, and Aaron's, their mother, Yocheved, I believe is how you pronounce it. She was singing a lullaby to Moses, basically telling him to fall asleep and just remember us as she sent him off on the river. Some people have actually said that it doesn't make sense that Moses would remember that song, especially considering how many years ago it was and that he's now an adult. But there is one thing I can give the film's credit. Earlier in the film, Moses was actually whistling the tune, And also, remember, this is a musical. In musicals, you utilize the music whenever you can. And in this case, it sparks Moses' memory, and it causes him to basically try to deny what Miriam was telling him. He's undergoing this crisis, which kicks into the next song called All I Ever Wanted. It's a shorter song, but it does actually stand in my mind, and is actually fairly easy for me personally to sing because it's at a lower key, and because I'm more baritone, which basically means that because I have a deeper voice, I'm not able to hit those high notes. It's a bit easier for me to sing. But anyway, I'm not going to sing any of these songs because I don't want to destroy your eardrums. But anyway, continuing, Moses falls asleep. He runs back to the palace. He falls asleep and has just this beautifully animated dream sequence of Moses reliving basically the opening scene of the movie where all of the Egyptian guards go out and basically slaughter the newborn Hebrew boys. He watches his mother, Miriam, and Aaron basically carry him to the river, send him off in the basket. Moses cries. Then it cuts to the guards running after him, which causes Moses to fall along with all the other infants. This scene is a perfect example of the phrase, show, don't tell. Excuse me. When you're making a film, there's a very important phrase. As a matter of fact, you guys have probably heard it before. It's called show, don't tell. Visual storytelling really takes off right here. The only thing that plays is the music. And so you're just watching this scene take place. And even though the animation in this scene isn't as good as the rest of the movie, the animation really follows like hieroglyphics and a bunch of paintings that the Egyptians are famous for. And just seeing this wonderful sequence take place in this film sets up everything for the rest of the film. Moses realizes that he's a Hebrew, and he realizes that everything that he's ever been led up to believe has been a lie. And it changes his whole perspective on everything for the rest of the film. He starts to see the Hebrews as his people and seeing how they're being whipped and pretty much beaten. And Moses was basically ignoring all of that because he believed that he was a true Egyptian. And now that he's seeing his people brutalized like this, it changes his whole perspective. So a little bit later, the queen meets up with Moses in the same spot where she pulled him from the river. And she sings the second half of the song, All I Ever Wanted. And she basically says that Moses now knows the truth. And pretty much, when the gods give you a blessing, you don't ask why it was sent. You basically just take that blessing and you make the most of it. So anyway, a little later, he meets up back again with Ramesses, as he's now able to have this new perspective of what he wants to do with a temple. But Moses is unable to see things the same way because, like I mentioned, he now sees himself as a Hebrew, and he's seeing that all of his people are being tortured. Especially this one older Hebrew who was being whipped by this one Egyptian guard. Moses runs after him, accidentally knocking him off of the viewing point, and ends up accidentally killing him. Because of this, it forces Moses to run away and leaving behind not only everything that he knew, but his brother Ramesses. his adopted brother Ramesses, but he was with him his whole life. And you can see through the animation that it's truly heartbreaking for Ramesses. He doesn't want Moses to leave, but Moses does not stay. In some of the best animation in the entire motion picture, it shows Moses going through the desert, and as each scene cuts to a new scene, well, like a new frame, it still shows him walking through the desert. But you can see, I actually learned this from another YouTube review, Moses gets smaller and smaller, which basically means that he's becoming more and more lost as the desert is basically starting to take his life. Meanwhile, Moses ultimately steps on a sharp rock. It cuts his sandal. He then takes off all of the jewelry that he was wearing. He was going to throw the ring away, but he decides to wear it for the next several years. And a huge dust storm comes by and basically buries Moses in it. And ultimately a camel ends up walking by, and the way that Moses' hair is, it looks like it's a little bit of grass sticking out of the sand. So the camel bites it, which ultimately uncovers Moses, and Moses grabs a hold of the camel, and the camel ultimately makes its way towards this watering pond for a bunch of sheep, where Moses ultimately starts drinking water because who knows the last time he had water. And during this entire scene, he manages to save these 3 Midianite girls from these bunch of bandits. But after doing so, he leans up against a well and falls into the well. And it's at this point where Zipporah shows back up, and her, along with the 3 other girls, who actually happen to be Zipporah's younger sisters, they pull Moses out of the well. Zipporah notices Moses, lets go of the rope, and Moses falls right back into the well. And at this point, one of the girls says, "That's why Papa says she'll never get married." It's kind of a funny line, but I do have one small problem with this. Usually when I hear something like that in a movie, that ultimately means, okay, well, I know those people are gonna end up getting married. Like, there's that tension between them, and then ultimately they're gonna get married, and then blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I still love this movie for what it is. But even though that's in this film, I still have read the book of Exodus many, many times. So, and of course, I've seen this movie hundreds of times. I've seen this movie a lot, as you can probably tell. But anyway, getting back to the plot. So Moses is cleaned up, and the high priest of Midian, Jethro, voiced by Danny Glover. Okay, that is the last major voice actor in this movie. There are other voice actors, but these are the main ones that most people would know. So, basically, Jethro invites Moses to be basically the person who they will honor that night. But Moses is saying that he's done nothing of importance in his life. Jethro then explains that he rescued Zipporah from Egypt, then he rescued his daughters from bandits. And then he sings this song called Through Heaven's Eyes. Now, this song is basically explaining that miracles they're not these major things that happen. Miracles can be seen in everyday life, such as sharing food, having everyone around you. Seeing that random acts of kindness can ultimately mean the world of difference. From the opening line of this song, a single thread in a tapestry, though its color brightly shines, can never see its purpose in the pattern of the grand design. It then dissolves into mountains, and the stone that sits on the very top of the mountain's mighty face, does it think it's more important than the stones that form the base? It's basically saying that even though it's a small part of this giant design, it still is as important as all the other patterns and everything that goes into it. Really just hearing this and then seeing how Moses basically, how do I put it? He transforms from being raised as an Egyptian to becoming closer and closer to God as he sees all these miracles that happen in everyday life. I could honestly go across the lyrics of this song all day, but I'm trying to keep this at a good pace, and even though I'm 25 minutes into it, I'm more than halfway through this movie. Also, one thing I haven't mentioned, this film is actually pretty unique because ever since Moses is introduced into this film, it pretty much follows him throughout the entire rest of the running time. Not a lot of films do that, but this is really the only one that I can think that really comes to my mind because it doesn't cut to different characters. It stays with Moses. He's the main character. He is the titular prince of Egypt. But I just think it's pretty awesome that it actually focuses on Moses pretty much since he's introduced. It doesn't really cut away to other people. And when it does, it's very, very brief because the main focus is on Moses and his whole hero's journey. So anyway, through the song, Moses and Zipporah grow closer together and they ultimately get married. And then the next scene is, in my opinion, not only the most beautifully animated sequence of the film, but in my opinion, one of the greatest animated scenes ever put to the big screen. The burning bush scene. So Moses follows this lamb. It's a literal lamb of God. As Moses follows it, the lamb takes him to inside of this little cave where we see the burning bush. And let me just say, the music in this scene is so well done. It's so beautiful. It's composed with this beautiful, quiet moment when Moses is introduced to the bush, and it gradually starts to pick up. In my opinion, if I'm making a movie trailer, this is the music that I would use for this scene. It's the burning bush theme from The Prince of Egypt. Every time I listen to this song, it gets me emotional. And honestly, it brings a tear to my eye. But in this scene, God speaks with Moses. God is actually voiced by Val Kilmer. So Val Kilmer is both the voice of Moses and the voice of God. Another little hidden detail, even though Val Kilmer's voice is the most prominent voice for God, you can hear whispers of everyone who he's met throughout his entire life. Miriam, Zipporah, Ramesses, but they're speaking in a bit of a whisper. It's a great detail, and seeing everything that went into this film, and everything, especially into this scene, the only way I can describe this scene is perfect. Another thing I want to mention, the Nostalgia Critic actually mentioned this. All of the elements actually take place in this scene. Fire, of course, for the burning bush, but you can also see the reflection of water, there's wind, and even rocks moving around for earth. So in this scene, God tells Moses that he wants Moses to be the leader and take the Hebrews out of Egypt and bring them to a good land. a land flowing with milk and honey. Oh, I forgot to mention something. When Moses first sees the bush, God actually tells him to remove his shoes from his feet because the place in which he walks is holy ground. I actually learned this from a YouTuber named Alan Tsai, Tsai, that when Moses removes his sandals from his feet in this scene, he actually remains barefoot throughout the entire film. I never noticed that before, but it's absolutely amazing seeing all of the details that went into the animation and just seeing how they were dedicated to showing that Moses knew that everything is holy ground, and the fact that he remains barefoot after coming into like face to face sort of with God. It's truly amazing seeing all the hidden details and just the really everything, all the care and everything that just went into this film. So anyway, God tells Moses that he will be with him always. Just to take the staff in his hand, and with it, he will be able to perform God's wonders. So Moses goes back to Zipporah and tells her that he needs to go back and free his people, and she ultimately goes along with him. Now, back in Egypt, Moses is greeted by Ramesses in basically a warm and embracing hug. Before I go any further, I need to talk about this scene from the Ten Commandments. When Moses returns to Egypt for the first time, Ramesses doesn't really welcome Moses back. He doesn't really show any emotion towards him, despite the fact that they grew up together as brothers. This is a scene from the Prince of Egypt, and it does this scene better because Ramesses runs up to Moses, picks him up, and gives him a hug. I honestly don't know why the Ten Commandments didn't do this, especially when the main conflict for the rest of the story is between two people who were raised as brothers, basically two brothers. And seeing that in animation it was done a lot better, it's one of the very few things that you can pull off an animation that makes it much better than it is in live action. So anyway, Moses tells Ramesses that he was sent by God to tell Ramesses to let his people go. Ramesses does not take it seriously. Moses places his staff in the center of the room, and it turns into a cobra. Ramesses then tells the high priest Hotep and Hoi to basically deal with Moses, and then we're introduced to the song Playing with the Big Boys. Now, I'm not going to lie when I say that this is probably the creepiest song in the film, and many other people say that it's the weakest song, but I honestly, it was actually brought to my attention by other movie critics who've talked about this movie. Remember how earlier I said that comedy breaks tension in movies? This is the comic relief song. It's a lot darker. The orchestrations done by Hans Zimmer gives it off that sinister feel. If you compare this song with other comic relief songs at the time, Friend Like Me by the Genie from Aladdin, Hakuna Matata by Timon and Pumbaa from The Lion King, even the Gargoyles song A Guy Like You from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Honestly, comparing Playing with the Big Boys to those other songs, it seems a lot more badass. So anyway, While this is happening, Hotep and Hoi each have 2 snakes, and Moses' snake ends up eating both of them. Moses then picks up the snake, which transforms back to his staff. Moses meets with Ramesses in another gorgeously animated scene. Ramesses ultimately understands the reason why Moses came back. And seeing all of the emotions that Ramesses goes through, just realizing that his brother really is lost forever, and he basically came back not really with a vengeance, but on a mission to free his people. He even takes off the ring that Ramesses gave him, places it on Ramesses' throne. Ramesses picks it up, looking sad, clutches it in his hand, and ultimately opens his eyes back up, and you can see the face of revenge. Ramesses refuses to let the Hebrews go, and he also doubles their workload entirely. Moses is then sort of attacked by the Hebrews for him basically being the reason why their workload has been doubled, as well as Aaron coming by and saying, Moses, when did you start caring about Hebrews or like slaves? Is it when you figured out that you were one of us? Miriam ultimately comes by, tells him that she's been a slave her entire life and never once has God answered one of her prayers. But no matter what, she would be there alongside Moses. This ultimately leads Moses to seeing Ramesses on a boat out on the Nile River. He walks down to there, tells Ramesses once again to let his people go. Ramesses, of course, declines this. Then he sends some of the guards after him. Moses stands in the Nile, takes his staff, places it in the water, and blood starts pretty much poisoning the Nile River. And seeing this take place, Ramesses still does not believe that he should let the Hebrews go. So he tells Hotep and Hoi to basically explain it to him, and Hotep and Hoi basically pull out this red powder, pour out some water, throw the powder into the water, turns it red, and so Ramesses still doesn't believe. Another little detail from the first time I ever saw this film, I actually noticed this. When Moses is standing in the water, the only part that's not blood, basically, is where Moses is standing. Basically, the water around him is still the regular water. I've always found that detail pretty cool. So anyway, Moses then tells the Hebrews that their faith will be the thing that ultimately frees them. Thus kicks off the next song, the Plagues song. This is visually the best song in the entire film. It's not the best song in the film, but it's the best visuals that go along with the song. There's another thing about the animation I actually failed to mention. Apparently the colors, depending on the colors that they use, it represents one thing and one represents another. The color orange represents the Hebrews and freedom, whereas the color blue represents the Egyptians and enslavement. As a matter of fact, in this scene of the Plague Song, you can see Moses' face light up orange and Ramesses' face light up blue. Calling back to the burning bush thing, the burning bush scene, When God actually mentions the Hebrews, the colors change from blue to orange. It's a nice little detail that I've never noticed before, and it actually makes sense when you start to realize just how much detail went into this film. So anyway, following the plague song, the plague of darkness covers basically Egypt. Moses meets with Ramses inside of the palace. Ramses sort of breaks down, wishing for things to go back to the way they were. But ultimately, Ramses' son comes by. Moses basically tells him to think of his son and what you're doing. All of your actions basically have consequences, and you refusing to let the Hebrews go is not only damaging yourself, but the Egyptians as well as your son. And then ultimately, the final plague comes by. The angel of death. But before this happens, Moses basically narrates and says, "Take a lamb, and with its blood, mark your door frame. When the angel comes by, they will know to pass over that house, leaving yourself safe." And during this scene, all of the firstborn boys are killed. It is an emotionally heavy scene. And when Ramses puts his son to rest, he covers him with a blanket or a sheet. Another hidden detail I learned from other movie reviews. You can hear the Egyptians screaming in terror that their child has just died. This is ultimately the breaking point for Ramses, and Ramses tells Moses that they have his permission to go. This leads into basically the defining song of the movie. The song that won the Oscar for Best Original Song, When You Believe. I can't really talk about how amazing this song is, aside from the fact that it features on the actual album. It's sung by Whitney Houston and Mariah Carey. I should honestly just stop there. It's beautifully sung. One of the greatest duets of a song, in my personal opinion, ever. And ultimately, this is the song that plays when Moses, Zipporah, Miriam, and Aaron lead all of the Hebrews out of Egypt. When they get to the Red Sea, Ramesses, along with an army, catch up to them with the intention of killing them. But in this scene, a pillar of fire blocks off Ramesses and the armies, which allows Moses to go to the Red Sea, take the staff in his hand, basically stick it down into the water, and it splits the sea open, leading to another brilliant scene of when they're walking through the Red Sea. You can I don't know if you guys can feel this, but during this scene, whenever I watch it, I can feel almost all of the details, the ground they're walking on, the darkness, even the water. Even though it's separated, it still feels like I can feel some of the water dripping down on me. It's truly astonishing just seeing how this animated film can have so many major sequences in it, to have me feel like I'm placed alongside the Hebrews in the Red Sea. That truly is amazing. But then the pillar of fire vanishes, and ultimately the army starts to chase after the Hebrews. But just as they cross the other side, the water starts to close over and it drowns many of the soldiers, but it pushes Ramesses away, putting him on one side of the sea and Moses and the Hebrews on the other side. Ultimately, there's a callback to when Moses first left Ramesses. Ramesses screams out Moses' name as he fades away, as Moses is the main thing still on screen. He once again tells Ramesses, "Goodbye, brother," turns around to be with his people, and they walk off. And the final scene of the movie is another rendition of Deliver Us, but this time it's just the musical score, as it shows Moses walking down off of Mount Sinai with the 10 Commandments in his hand. He stands there looking at his people. You get this triumphant shot as the film delivers the final line of the song, "Deliver Us" by Yocheved, cuts to black, thus ending The Prince of Egypt. All I can say is wow. This movie is truly a spectacle in and of itself. Earlier I mentioned that there are animated films that change cinema. This, unfortunately, was not one of them. It was a hand-drawn film released at a time when CGI was starting to take over. As a matter of fact, the first ever DreamWorks movie, Ants, was a CGI animated film. The Prince of Egypt was a traditionally hand-drawn movie, but it features some scenes of CGI. Most notably, the basket that Moses is put into, the nose when it's falling from the statue and chasing after Ramesses and Moses at the beginning, as well as a lot of the plagues. Seeing the fire falling from the sky, the clouds, the angel of death, and even the water from the Red Sea was all computer generated. Just the amount of detail that went into this film, and seeing everything, seeing big drawings for animation, big transitions, big songs, everything that I associate with big for an animated film pretty much comes from this movie. It has a timeless story, a fantastic cast, songs that have stuck with me throughout my entire life, even just the regular musical score without lyrics. Many of them stand out with emotional moments. Hearing the Burning Bush theme specifically, really just almost perfection in a way. As well as the animation, just being able to feel all of these sort of environments. Basically, when I've watched this movie, it feels like I'm with these characters. When the wind comes by and the dust flies, it feels like the dust is really flying through the air and basically hitting my skin. And to have an animated film do that, that shows not only hidden details, but just so much dedication. You can tell that this is truly a passion project by some people who really wanted to bring this story to life. And this might be controversial. I think that this is a better film than the 10 Commandments. Even though the 10 Commandments changed cinema with so many new techniques and everything that went into it, the amazing costume design, the beautiful sound design, the actors, the casting, just everything that went into that film is grand in scale and epic in nature. But I still find myself coming back to The Prince of Egypt because it's a more focused story. It's only 99 minutes long, whereas the Ten Commandments is over 3 hours long. Which, yes, the Ten Commandments has more time to build out the world and basically builds up these characters. But The Prince of Egypt focuses on the story. And like I said at the very beginning of the film, it says we believe this to be the most genuine version of this story. And in my opinion, it's the perfect rendition of this story. I don't see a lot of problems with this movie. Yes, every movie has its problems. No movie is perfect. But this animated film, just seeing everything that takes place in it, some gorgeous animation, strong emotional weight from the characters, and everything else truly is a spectacle that needs to be seen to be believed. And to have a motion picture do that, it's truly one of a kind in its own way. And when a film has me constantly coming back to it, you know that it's hitting all of the nails on the head. It's doing whatever it must to make people want to rewatch it again and again and again. And to have a movie do that, I'd have to say that's pretty perfect. A perfect 10 out of 10. Even though this movie is titled as Prince, in my opinion, this is the king of animated films. Now, with all that being said, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. And once again, if you have any suggestions for me for this podcast, I invite you to leave them in the comments below. But as of right now, my name is Sean Arguello, and you have just listened to I Don't Know What to Name This Show. This is me saying goodbye for now, but not forever. I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.